ceremonious opening of the warrant which established the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers and actually appointed your first colonel, who was an old and very loyal friend of King James II. And the warrant is dated the 11th day of June in the year 1685. Now, many among you will realize that that very day, exactly the same day, in Dorset, the Duke of Monmouth, illegitimate son of Charles II, landed and unfurled his banner. It was exactly the same day, and it was the first serious military challenge to the new regime. James II had peacefully succeeded his brother Charles II in February 1685, and things began very well. In his impromptu speech to the Privy Council, which was very widely reported, James denied the charge that he was a man for arbitrary power. On the contrary, he pledged to respect, I'm quoting James, the laws of England, and the address was very well received, and the reign began with extensive goodwill from the Tory Anglicans who had helped Charles II weather the crisis caused by the hysteria surrounding the so-called Popish plot and the parliamentary attempt to exclude James from the throne as a professed Roman Catholic. In the first half of the 1680s, the Stuart regime had stabilized, and James began with very considerable and widespread support, and he decided to retain his brother's ministers. There was a plethora of loyal addresses. The people of Loughborough, for example, showed especial zeal in proclaiming the new king, sacrificing, as an eyewitness reported, several hogs' heads to His Majesty's health. Parliamentary elections that spring, by dint of successful government management and the purge of corporations under Charles II, returned an overwhelmingly Tory, Anglican, loyal House of Commons. And only 57 of the 513 seats in the House of Commons went to known Whigs, as the supporters of exclusion were called. In May 1685, Titus Oates, a villain whose false testimony had ignited the violence of the Popish plot, was sentenced to stand in the pillory in 2 different parts of London, where he was pelted with eggs and exposed to the hostility of the crowd. James, who'd been a professional soldier as well as Lord High Admiral under his brother, inherited a small and poorly equipped army, barely over 8,500 men. He also inherited a fleet whose shortcomings had been exposed in the Anglo-Dutch War of 1672-4. And so one of the new king's first objectives was to build up his forces, and this he did rapidly. By the end of 1685, he had nearly 20,000 soldiers under arms, an enormous expansion. And the formation of the Fusiliers was part of this rapid build-up, although it was too late for the Fusiliers to play an active part in defeating the Monmouth rebels. Not only was the army increased in numbers, but it was modernized with the help of one of the notable new breed of civil servants, William Blathwayt, whose name recurs in your early annals, Secretary at War, the sort of military army equivalent to Samuel Pepys in the Navy. It was the French army, after a quarter of a century of largely successful operations behind them, who were the acknowledged models for the changes which were instituted in drill, tactics, and weaponry. The army into which the young Marlborough, as he later became, was commissioned in the late 1660s as an ensign in the 1st Foot Guards, was armed principally with pikes, matchlock muskets, and lobster-tail helmets in a fashion which would have been very familiar to Oliver Cromwell. Now, you are professional military experts, so I must be very careful what I say at this point, but as I understand it, as Colonel Lamb said, the fusil was a flintlock musket, not a matchlock, whose name was derived from the French word facile, meaning a piece of flint. The term Fusilier had already been used officially by the French army in 1670 to describe soldiers whose duty it was to guard and escort artillery, as well as keeping order among the civilian teams who manhandled the guns. And a flintlock, of course, was rather less likely than a matchlock to ignite the powder barrels which supplied the cannon. The Duke of Monmouth, hoping to raise the West Country, where he had been rapturously received during his progresses in his father's reign, made landfall in Lyme Regis. The MP for Lyme Regis happened to be Sir Winston Churchill, the father of the future Duke of Marlborough, Colonel of the Fusiliers. And it was his son, after receiving messages from Lyme Regis, it was his son, newly ennobled as Baron Churchill of Sandridge, that had happened in May 1685, who woke up James II to tell him the news of the invasion. And he was sent west under the command of Lord Feversham. Interestingly enough, Lord Feversham was himself, in origin, a French Protestant, to confront the so-called Pitchfork Rebellion. After some inconclusive manoeuvring, the rebels were easily defeated by the professionals at the Battle of Sedgemoor. And the ease with which the rebellion was snuffed out and the ignominious end of Monmouth himself underlined a widespread support for James and his government in the first half of 1685. Because the fear which united the majority was of a return to the violence and the religious fanaticism of the Civil War. The Civil War in which 100,000 people perished, a greater proportion of the population than in World War I. We perhaps don't realize that these decades were dominated by a sort of Fawlty Towers-like determination. Don't mention the war! But it was in everybody's mind. Oliverian times were constantly referred to, and the threat of extremists, religious fanatics, what a contemporary feel that has, threatening civil peace. So at the beginning of James's reign, neither rabid anti-Catholicism, Oates had been discredited, nor enthusiasm for absolutism defined English politics. The parliamentary elections in March 1685 revealed that the vast majority of the political nation was willing to accept a Catholic king as long as he was content to rule within the parameters of the Constitution established in church and state. Why then, barely 3 years later, was it possible for another invader to land a substantial army in the West Country and provoke the flight of the king, your founder? A great deal of recent scholarly research has been done on this period, which has suffered in the past from a somewhat Anglo-centric conviction of English particularity. Tim Harris, in his 2006 book, Revolution, has amplified the wider British context in his study of events in Ireland and Scotland. Steve Pincus, a professor at Yale, in his 2009 book, 1688, The First Modern Revolution, has focused on the wider European context, while Philip Mansell, in his various writings on the reign of Louis XIV, has illuminated the French model of modernization, which profoundly influenced the policies of James II. James was an experienced soldier and naval commander. He lived in Paris between 1648 and 1655. He'd been trained in the French army. He'd been converted to Catholicism by a French Jesuit. He'd married a second wife chosen by Louis XIV and was an admirer of the king's success in remodeling the French state along centralized, absolutist lines. It appeared to be the wave of the future. The exclusion crisis had convinced James, I'm quoting him now from one of his letters, that the monarchy must be either more absolute or quite abolished. The French subsidy on his accession in 1685 was a handsome £500,000. The cost of maintaining his greatly enlarged army, which shot up, you remember, from 8,500 to 20,000 by the end of the year, persuaded the king that he also needed a substantial parliamentary grant. And when Parliament convened after those very successful elections, the Chancellor of the Exchequer asked for the largely loyalist House of Commons for a grant of £1,200,000. This must be all so familiar to Colonel Lamb with his present work on the Defence Review and arguing with politicians. After a series of close votes, the Commons agreed on £700,000. But, meanwhile, there was criticism in the House of Lords that the king was awarding commissions in the army to Roman Catholics in violation of the Test Act of 1673, which stipulated that all office holders should be communicant members of the Church of England. And James was present in person to hear the Lords' debate, and he was so displeased that he decided to dispense with Parliament altogether, which was prorogued in November 1685. He lost, in consequence, the grant of £700,000, but he was never to call a Parliament again in his reign. The Privy Council was purged. People began to understand the radical extent of the king's modernising ambitions. A new cabinet council became the centre of policy making, dominated by Catholic co-religionists and notably Jesuits, the most significant one being Father Edward Peter. Charles II, much more discreet about his religious views, had once said of his brother James, "He will lose his kingdom by his bigotry, and he will lose his soul for a lot of ugly trollops." I think the latter observation is perhaps somewhat unfair. Although he was notable in his early years for a vast and somewhat undiscriminating sexual appetite, in later life and in exile, James actually offended many in the French court by excessive religiosity and self-flagellation. But it is certainly true that he was a man who ran to extremes. He had an extreme temperament and was subject to terrifying rages. And one of his early targets was the judiciary. he looked for ways of appointing judges who shared his exalted view of royal authority. The refusal of both houses of Parliament to countenance the employment of Catholics in the army encouraged James to insist that his authority was above that of Parliament. He put pressure on the judges to declare that the king's prerogative gave him the right to dispense with the penalties of the laws and to suspend their execution, and dissentient judges were dismissed. In April 1686, so this is the new year, this is the spring, there was a very important test case brought by the chauffeur, the coachman of Sir Edward Hales, well known to Fusiliers when he became Lieutenant of the Tower of London the following year. The coachman, Arthur Godden, alleged that his employer had accepted a commission as a colonel despite being disbarred by the Test Act. It's a put-up job, obviously. It was a test case to test the limits of the royal prerogative. The judgment was widely publicised, and the judges by 11-1 ruled that Hales had a valid dispensation from the king, and to most observers it was clear that the case had been brought to ascertain which belike to get and continue uppermost, the prerogative or the hitherto pretended liberties of the subject. Far from being a reactionary throwback, it became clear that James, inspired by the example of Louis XIV, aimed at creating a modern, absolutist state on the French model, with a centralizing bureaucracy, a professional standing army, and a world-class navy. Samuel Pepys attested that James was instrumental in raising the navy of England from the lowest state of impotence. I think it must have been rather like the atmosphere in the 1930s, as people looked beyond these shores and saw absolute governments being installed in country after country. It really did look as if the wave of the future lay with authoritarian regimes. Now, we're used to strategic reviews, well, Colonel Lamb particularly, which assess our defense needs as a nation and identify the principal threats. And as a loyal ally of Louis XIV, James was content that the French king should dominate continental Europe, while he was clearer than most in seeing the future of his three kingdoms, England, Scotland, and Ireland, as the center of a sea-borne trading empire built on the outposts which had already been established in India, the Caribbean, and North America. William Blathwayt again, James's Secretary at War, observed in 1685 that those plantations which hitherto were looked upon as desperate adventures are now become necessary and vital members of the main body. The colonies were turning a profit. It was also obvious that our principal competitors in the race for domination of these new markets were the Dutch, whose seizure of Bantam, for example, threatened to exclude British traders from the East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. Tension with the Dutch increased. In the summer of 1686, the Algerine corsairs, who were at war with the Dutch, were given by the king free use of English ports and allowed to sell their captured Dutch prizes in England. And the following year, the 6 British regiments in service with the Dutch States General were recalled, although not all of them obeyed the order to return home. The thing to grasp is that England was changing very rapidly. Overseas trade had already greatly increased. England was more urban, more taken up with manufacturing. The best estimate is that whereas 80% of the English population was involved in agriculture in early Tudor times, the figure had fallen to about 60% in the later part of the 17th century. And only in the Netherlands was there a comparable transformation. The shift was especially marked after the restoration of the monarchy, when the so-called new draperies, often associated with Dutch and Huguenot immigrants, had succeeded in capturing fresh Mediterranean markets. Coal production increased, together with glass-making, ceramics, shipbuilding. Much of this activity centered in London, whose population grew exponentially. Whereas in 1550, the population of the capital had been about 75,000, by James's reign, it had grown to 575,000. And in such a vastly enlarged city, ideas and political sentiments circulated with great velocity. Londoners in King James's reign were served by a huge variety of places to meet, coffee houses above all, home to political and literary cliques, but where above all commercial intelligence was available. And of course, as you know, a great institution like Lloyd's, the insurance market, began life in a coffee house. The proceeds of the growing customs and excise levies, which the king enjoyed, together with generous subsidies from the King of France, enabled him to finance his military expansion without resort to Parliament. And at the same time, in an effort to control the news agenda, he created a more sophisticated surveillance regime, particularly using the royal monopoly of the newly established post office. It soon became clear to contemporaries that letters were opened as a matter of course by a network of informers. The press was also censored, and there was an attempt to ban newsletters. But this is something which is a great contrast to today. In the absence of newspapers, control of the pulpit was a vital part of the machinery for molding public opinion, because this was one of the main ways in which opinion was diffused, in which debates were held. And on his own authority, in 1686, James established a commission for ecclesiastical causes, whose purpose was, it was said, the prevention of indiscreet preaching. The Bishop of London, Henry Compton, amazing man, refused to conform to the commission's orders, arguing that they had no legal foundation. And the decision to send him on gardening leave caused a sensation, and not only in the Church of England. It really was gardening leave, actually, because Compton went back to Fulham Palace. He was a very enthusiastic botanist, and as the bishop in charge of the plantations in the New World, some really significant species like redwood, magnolia, were first indigenized in Europe in the Bishop of London's garden in Fulham Palace, which is being recreated in our own time. So Henry Compton was sent off on gardening leave, and this caused a sensation. Protestants were only supposed to preach good morals. Catholics were encouraged to proselytize. James's own printer, Henry Hills, turned out numerous translations of French polemical works, notably those by Bishop Bossway, an advocate of the absolutist state and a stern critic of the semi-representative French provincial parlement. The bishop saw those as old-fashioned, the source of internal weakness, and productive of the kind of dissent which had paralyzed France in the early years of Louis's reign. And Bossway was also an enthusiastic supporter of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which had guaranteed some limited rights for French Protestants, the Huguenots. And as a result of Louis's edict in October, it's all coming together. Shockwaves from France, October 1685. Protestant churches were destroyed. Schools were closed. All pastors were instructed to leave the country. Tens of thousands of Huguenots sought refuge in James's three kingdoms, much to the advantage of economic life and manufacturing of various kinds. More than 50,000 arrived in England. Canterbury became a French-speaking town. 10,000 went to Ireland. Vivid descriptions of the sufferings of the French Protestants in the 1680s heightened fears in England, despite the efforts of the government to deny the many atrocity stories as fake news. Jean-Claude's gory account of the persecution and oppressions of the Protestants of France was condemned by the French ambassador, who persuaded the government to burn it by the common hangman. The expanded bureaucracy, the enlarged army, began to have an ever greater penetration and impact on ordinary life, on daily life in every part of the country. And nowhere was this more resented than in the arrangements for quartering the army in the absence of sufficient space in barracks. In 1686, there was a most extraordinary example of the new power of the bureaucratic state. There was a survey of all the available beds in every tavern in England, a prodigious exercise which illustrated the growing reach and professionalism of central government in a country which had hitherto been largely administered locally. Tavern keepers were ordered to provide accommodation for troops or lose their licenses. And in London, soldiers were billeted in Fleet Street, Salisbury Court. Dissenting chapels in the Broad Street area were requisitioned. And when winter came, the army was quartered in 100 towns and villages scattered across the whole of England. But it was also in 1686 that the king decreed that no soldier was to be subject to either the common law or parliamentary statute. And it proved to be very difficult under martial law to obtain any redress for offences committed by the troops, and the volume of complaints about the behaviour and the exactions of the military became deafening, nowhere more so than in London, where the annual military reviews on Hounslow Heath were used not only for training, but also to suppress discontent and overawe the capital. Following the example of Louis XIV, James also sought to make use of his Catholic co-religionists to offer his new state-building enterprise. But it is vital at this point to recognize that we are not dealing here with any simple Catholic versus Protestant drama. One of the severest critics of the policies of Louis XIV and James II was Pope Innocent XI. Neither of the modernizing monarchs had any intention of submitting to papal control of the church in their domains. Louis's Gallican Catholic absolutist ideology was developed by his own allies among the Jesuit order in a way that was criticized and detested by the Pope. And very soon, Jesuit influence in England was also seen to be growing, much to the express disgust of the papal nuncio and the Spanish ambassador. And Louis made clear his instrumental use of his brand of Catholicism in a very revealing letter to the King of Siam in 1681. The king wrote, "Catholicism is the religion which is the highest, the noblest, and above all the best suited to enable kings to reign absolutely over their peoples." Catholics were still a very small minority in the British population, and the efforts to enlist them in the service of the new absolutist state were hampered by their numbers. So in 1687, the king's attention turned to Oxford and to the possibility of converting the wealthy Magdalen College into a Catholic institution of higher education. He at first attempted to impose a recent convert, Anthony Farmer, as president of Magdalen in defiance of its statutes. It soon became clear that Farmer was, in the language of our own day, a sexual predator, and that he had converted, as he later explained, only for preferment. The resistance of the fellows of the college, however, infuriated the king, and according to the French ambassador Barillon, James worked himself into an extraordinary fury and, transported with anger, told them he knew well how to make these Oxford men obey. And very soon the Ecclesiastical Commission embarked upon an examination of all college statutes in Oxford and Cambridge as a prelude to further Catholicization. At the same time, there was a determined assault on the loyalists who'd welcomed James's accession, the Tory Anglican officers in local government. By March 1687, 498 new JPs had been appointed, 2/3 of whom were Roman Catholics, and by June the following year, 1/3 of all the deputy lieutenants in the counties and 1/5 of all JPs were Roman Catholics, despite their constituting only about 2% of the population as a whole. 3/4 of those who had been justices of the peace in 1685 at the accession of James II had been dismissed from the bench. Corporations in the towns and London livery companies experienced similar purges, and in the midst of these changes, which had an impact on the day-to-day government and administration of justice in every shire in England, people noticed. Lady Harvey, most marvelously outspoken lady of the period, in conversation with a number of Anglican bishops who had spent their lives preaching up the doctrine of non-resistance to royal will, Lady Harvey said to these bishops, "You, my lords, have made a turd pie, seasoned it with passive obedience, and now you must eat it yourselves." Increasing resistance, however, from the Church of England persuaded the king to make tactical overtures to Protestant dissenters, and he recruited the Quaker William Penn to support his declaration of indulgence, which promised toleration to both Catholics and dissenters. It's the sort of measure which we would feel naturally very sympathetic with. But, as the Presbyterian Daniel Defoe pointed out, the treatment meted out to the fellows of Magdalen, deprived of their freeholds by a most arbitrary sentence of a court, proved that all our freeholds and estates shake by this sentence. And in May 1688, 7 bishops, led by the Archbishop of Canterbury, refused the king's command to instruct the clergy to read the royal declaration of indulgence from their pulpits. And their refusal, they said, did not arise from any want of due tenderness to dissenters. Instead, they objected to the declaration because it was founded on such a dispensing power as hath oft been declared illegal in parliaments. The king was incandescent. He committed the bishops to the Tower, whither they went by boat, the banks of the Thames being thronged by cheering crowds. And once in the Tower itself, the Fusiliers, who were on guard, repeatedly insisted on drinking the bishop's health, despite a direct order from the Lieutenant, Sir Edward Hales, to desist. The bishops were brought to trial in Westminster Hall on the 29th of June before a jury which had been subject to intense pressure to secure a conviction. One of the members of that jury was the king's brewer, Michael Arnold, and he remarked that he faced a stark choice. Whatever I do, I'm sure to be half ruined. If I say not guilty, I shall brew no more for the king. And if I say guilty, I shall brew no more for anyone else. In the event, the bishops were acquitted amid scenes of jubilation. And that same day, detachments from a number of Irish regiments were sent to relieve the Fusiliers, who were sent away from the Tower to the camp on Hounslow Heath. The commotion of the trial and the acquittal of the bishops overshadowed what, for James, was the great event of that month, June 1688, the birth of the Prince of Wales on June the 10th. And whilst the disaffected had been able to hope that progress towards an absolutist regime could be reversed by the succession of the Princesses Mary and Anne, James's daughters by his first wife, Anne Hyde, the safe delivery of a son to Queen Mary of Modena opened up the prospect of the irreversible consolidation of the modernizing project. In the hysteria surrounding the acquittal of the bishops, on June the 29th, no one noticed the Admiral of the Fleet, Arthur Herbert, stealing out of the city, dressed as a common seaman, carrying a letter from 7 notables, including the suspended Bishop of London, inviting William of Orange, James's nephew and son-in-law, to intervene in defense of the Constitution, which James was endeavoring, with some considerable success, to subvert. The invitation came to a prince who was already a veteran of resistance to the expansion of France. Louis XIV's grand design was to promote the grandeur of his dynasty and to enlarge French territories along the Rhine, the Rhone, the Mississippi, and the Mekong. Louisiana is named after him, and it's a souvenir of his North American ambitions. By 1688, Louis XIV had already devastated the prosperous cities of what is now southern Germany and laid waste to large tracts of the Low Countries. And by September 1688, the Pope was describing Louis XIV as the common enemy of Western Europe. The French king, who had invaded the papal enclave of Avignon earlier in the year, was accused of aiming at a universal monarchy. Louis's Catholicism did not prevent him from defying the Pope, maintaining a close alliance with the Ottoman Turks, and aiding Protestant rebels in Hungary in an effort to undermine the Catholic Habsburg Emperor. This is one of the great turning points in the history of early modern Europe. Religion was still a significant political factor, but it was no longer the decisive one, as states and dynasties jostled for supremacy. William of Orange's flotilla set sail in November. Half his force was British. Much of his finance came from cash contributions from the likes of the Earl of Danby, one of Charles II's most prominent ministers, who raised a mortgage on his own estates to support the invasion. The British fleet, under the command of the Colonel of the Fusiliers, the Earl of Dartmouth, was confined by contrary winds to the Thames estuary. There were Fusiliers on board, serving as Marines. They were under an officer called Lieutenant Livesey. Loyalties, however, were divided. Livesey himself was suspected of favouring the Dutch, and he was arrested and sent back to London. He seems to have recovered his commission later under the new regime and served as a major general in Marlborough's later campaigns as part of the Grand Alliance formed to resist the ambitious Louis XIV. William landed at Brixham on November the 5th, and by November the 9th, 1688, was in Exeter, somewhat disappointed that he'd not as yet been joined by any notables. There's a wonderful description of the procession he put on through the streets on the way to the cathedral where they held a service, although both the bishop and the dean had fled. The procession, the military procession, was spectacular. 200 soldiers from Suriname, followed by 200 Laplanders in black armor, reindeer skins and broadswords, then 600 of the elite Dutch Blue Guard, and 21 enormous brass cannon, each dragged by 16 cart horses. I wouldn't have liked to clear up after that procession. James hastened to Salisbury to confront the invaders, and the Royal Army was about double the size of the invaders. But its unity was fragile, and one centre of disaffection was the so-called Cockpit Circle, named after the Princess Anne's lodgings in the Palace of Whitehall. And at the centre of the Cockpit Circle was John and Sarah Churchill. It was a network that brought together mainly Tory Protestants, increasingly disturbed by the King's proceedings, and not least by his purge of the army and other institutions, and the consequent threat to freeholds and promotions. There was a good deal at stake here if you were a professional building your career, as Marlborough was. Henry Compton, the suspended Bishop of London, toured the country, recruiting other sympathizers on behalf of the Cockpit plotters. But having joined his army, James began to suffer from a series of immobilizing nosebleeds. And at the same time, his forces suffered a number of significant defections, notably Lord Churchill and the robustly Protestant Princess Anne's husband, George, Prince of Denmark. Churchill had owed much to the patronage of James, both as Duke of York and King. It was Marlborough who'd been sent to Paris in 1685, ostensibly to announce the accession of James II, but really to thank the French king for his handsome subsidy. Churchill had played a leading part in defeating Monmouth's army at the Battle of Sedgemoor, but as a member of the Cockpit group, he'd become increasingly disaffected. And in the event, he jumped at the right time, with the result that he was elevated to an earldom under the new regime. From April 1689, we can properly call him Marlborough. He became the Earl of Marlborough. James was demoralized. He returned to London, writing to his old friend, the Colonel of the Fusiliers, Dartmouth, "Never any prince took more care of his sea and land men than I've done. and have been so very ill repaid by them. On arrival in London, he found that his daughter, Anne, had been spirited away by the Bishop of London. Henry Compton was a former cavalry officer. He galloped away with Princess Anne, wearing a suit of armour, up the Great North Road. Not a very episcopal vestment. He never really recovered his reputation after that. He was accompanied by an ensign carrying a banner proclaiming, "Nolumus leges Angliae mutare." We do not wish the laws of England to be changed. The Prince of Orange continued to make slow progress. By November the 30th, he was at Wincanton, where he publicly hanged 2 soldiers for stealing a chicken. Most of the Fusiliers were still in London, as the capital and much of the rest of the country spiraled out of control. Tension was increased by the widely reported atrocities in Portsmouth, where Irish troops killed some 40 people when they fired on the congregation at a church service. There were popular risings in many parts of the country, and in early December, for instance, Pepys reported to Dartmouth, your colonel, that Dover Castle had been taken on behalf of the Prince of Orange by some of the rabble of the town, not headed by any officer that I can hear of, civil or military. By contrast, the officers of the garrison of Berwick, much to the horror of their governor, Sir Thomas Haggerston, a Jacobite loyalist, decided to declare for a free parliament and to assist the Prince of Orange. When the King fled London on December the 11th, throwing the Great Seal in the Thames, the Fusiliers were purged of all Jacobite officers, including the 2 sons of the unfortunate governor of Berwick, Sir Thomas Haggerston. Lord Dartmouth, the colonel, back from the fleet, was sent, ironically, to the Tower of London, where he died without being brought to trial. The new government emptied London of English regiments to make way for the Dutch, but not before one of the Fusilier officers, Captain Saint-Ange, a Frenchman, had been arrested as a spy and sent to Newgate, just down the road. From this point, the Fusiliers, while still armed with their trademark fusils, ceased to be considered, as Colonel Lamb pointed out, as an exclusively ordnance regiment. In 1689, Fusiliers embarked at Harwich for service in the continental theatre of the war against King Louis. They distinguished themselves at the Battle of Walcourt, together with the Earl of Marlborough, who was then appointed the Fusiliers' colonel by William III in succession to Dartmouth. I'm not sure that the Fusiliers saw very much of their new colonel, who was, like Colonel Lamb, much occupied in reorganizing the army, whose loyalty to the new regime was still uncertain. But after seeing service in the Low Countries, the Fusiliers were back in England by June 1690, ready to defend the country against a threatened French invasion after the disastrous defeat of the Anglo-Dutch fleet off Beachy Head. These were months, years of fear, high drama and tension. Parliament was summoned. A Bill of Rights, which reflected a bipartisan opposition to royal power to suspend and dispense with laws on the basis of the prerogative. The Ecclesiastical Commission was abolished, and the keeping of a standing army in peacetime without parliamentary sanction was forbidden. And as a member of a very obscure committee in the House of Lords, the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee, every single year we scrutinize and duly pass a regulation in obedience to the Bill of Rights, which formally signifies parliamentary approval for the continuing presence of the army on British soil. The success of William's intervention, his victories in Ireland, led to a revolution in foreign policy, which saw British troops, including the Fusiliers, committed in a 9 years war on the continent. The army during this period hugely increased, averaging nearly 120,000 men under arms, with a further expansion of the navy, and military expenditure grew to 5.5 million a year. And in consequence, the annual tax burden was double what it had been in James's reign. And one of the first measures of the Parliament which met in 1689 was to authorize a new tax, the land tax, to supplement the traditional indirect taxes on manufactured goods. Under Dutch influence, new financial mechanisms were introduced to pay for the expense of the war, because the huge increase in the expense of military operations had been one of the driving forces behind the attempt to centralize, to modernize the state. In particular, the creation of the Bank of England in 1694 proved to be a vital conduit for credit to support the war effort and to service the escalating national debt. The 9 years' war with Louis XIV lasted until the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, only to be followed very soon by the War of Spanish Succession, in which Marlborough and the Fusiliers won great victories. And we were at war with the French for much of the following century until the final act at the Battle of Waterloo. But at this point, recognizing the fact that the seats are hard and you've been very patient and courteous, we ought to leave the Fusiliers as they march into the succession of European wars, where battle honors and memories accumulated. Some of the details are on your banner. It's another story, but I think on this occasion it would be right, as we look back on the crisis of the years which surrounded your foundation, it's right to salute the founder, but above all, to do honor to the officers, the men, and the women of the Fusiliers who have, over the centuries, served, fought, and died to secure the relatively peaceful and prosperous conditions which the post-war generation has enjoyed. Let us hope that we do not squander their sacrifices in this very dangerous world. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, wasn't that a tour de force? Fantastic. Lord Chartres has kindly agreed to answer a few questions. Perhaps I could start the ball rolling by asking you, sir, whether you are greatly concerned about the growth of the role of the state in modern times, based on that experience.
I think that I believe that we ought to invest much more in local government, in small communities, because one of the things that makes for delight and creativity in life is giving people agency, giving them control. I'm so sorry, that's a division in the House of Commons. I hope it's not ominous. People need agency if they're to have lives that have a sense of meaning and dignity. And I believe very much that while there are understandable demands that public authority take more and more responsibility for our safety and our well-being, it really ought to be on a local basis as far as possible. And I see the hollowing out of local government and the concentration of power in the centre as undermining that sense of the agency and the dignity of individual communities and people. Hope that's not too coded.
If anybody else has a question, I'll bring the microphone to you. Put your hand up. Any questions?
I have a wonderful vision of being the guard commander at the Tower with all those suspended bishops. What fun that would have been. But my serious question is, you had a lovely phrase, the control of the pulpit, 330, 50 years ago. And you mentioned the authority of the church, that although it wasn't then decisive, it was still hugely significant. And my question is, today, that significance, that authority seems to be cruelly eroded and perhaps terminally eroded. And I wonder if we could have a few thoughts from you on that.
Well, as an institution for moulding public opinion, clearly you're right. One must remember that in the 1680s and 1690s, I think the Daily Courant was the first daily newspaper published not very far away from here. So there were no daily newspapers. There were newsletters, which of course the government had largely succeeded in controlling and censoring. So the one way of diffusing views and ideas which the government didn't entirely control was the thousands of parish churches and pulpits up and down the country. So it was a very crucial matter then. But clearly there are all sorts of ways in which people get their information now and communicate with one another, and the pulpit certainly doesn't have that kind of salience. Although I think that the energy that is generated from small face-to-face communities who are gathered together by common values, by support for one another, that's what's really crucial. That's the oxygenating plants in social life. And while it is implausible in an age when people are not very deferential, we're almost the last people who can talk about morality are bishops. Nevertheless, face-to-face communities of people who are trying to live out their faith, supporting one another, celebrating, reaching out, not as introverted huddles of piety. I think that is immensely significant for society. And indeed, many of the things which we hear daily, the mental health challenge among young people, all sorts of social ills, which the instinct of our rulers sometimes is to reach for new legislation, to try and sort it out by new regulations. As a matter of fact, what you really need is a network of face-to-face, supportive, non-judgmental, believing, celebrating communities. I'm not talking C of E, I'm not talking any particular church, I'm not even talking about Christian communities, but I'm talking about those local communities of faith and celebration up and down the country. And one of the puzzles of the last 20 years is how this blindingly obvious fact that we desperately need such a network, we have it in embryo, as I saw so very clearly in the East End as Bishop of Stepney. All the things, when my mother was brought up there before World War II, all the things which brought the community together had collapsed. The Labour Party as a mass membership organisation, the unions, they'd all vanished. The only thing that hadn't vanished was the mosques, the gurdwaras, the churches, the chapels. And so this is a fact of enormous significance. And if only more attention, perhaps on the part of church leadership as well, could be paid to that kind of operation, and less to sort of public expressions of concern about the childcare arrangements of Dominic Cummings and the sort of, that sort of thing. We might be better for it.
My Lord, may I just say thank you from those online who have expressed their thanks, and you won't have heard their claps, but I assure you they were sort of whooping and cheering in their house.
Zoom buddies, I salute you, I salute you. I have been one of you for the last however months.
One of the questions from them is, how different was the Fusilier regimental experience different to those of other regiments in the late 17th century in the sort of English-British Army?
Well, as I said, when the Fusiliers came into existence, there were perhaps only 8,500 men in a pretty shambolic military force, and the Fusiliers were in at the ground floor of this enormous expansion, which very soon, within 10 years of their foundation, meant that there were 120,000 under arms, and the Fusiliers were a very significant part of that. So they would have experienced military operations on a scale, with a fearsomeness, with an expense, with a complexity, which no previous generation had known before. If you look at some of the details of what was involved in the campaigns of Marlborough, it's light years away from the army in which he was commissioned. I just thought that little vignette of, was it the 26 vast brass cannons pulled by 16 huge Suffolk punches, it just was an illustration of how everything was getting bigger, more complex, more dangerous, and also with the campaigns of Louis XIV, there was no very great discrimination between combatants and non-combatants. I mean, towns were sacked, whole populations were slaughtered. So I take my hat off to all those people who were involved in the escalation of the cost, the ferocity, and the destructiveness of war.
My Lord, it's not often I get a chance to turn the tables on a former Bishop of London, but both in your delivery and your response to the subsequent questions, I have only one word to offer you, which you offered to a retiring bishop, a suffragan bishop, some years ago. Axios. Oh. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
I understand it means he is worthy.
Right.
Following the rise
I
of
know,
populism,
I put him in on the Isle of Dogs.
a number of countries in the world are now headed by scoundrels. Do you think there are things in the history of the period you taught talked about, lessons that would help us to deal with popularism?
Well, I think one of the things to get past is the idea that James was some kind of extraordinary throwback. He was surfing the wave of the future: efficiency, centralization, building up your forces. I think that the story of James and the early years of the Fusiliers show how important it is to contest the erosion of every single one of our personal and communal liberties. And that, well, it's a very common phrase, but it's one that is absolutely true. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. It is. I mean, at the moment, interestingly enough, you see, we've got Rhodesia, haven't we? Where the judiciary is under enormous attack and pressure for having refused to bend the rules to extend the tenure of somebody who was particularly close to the government. And I do hope that in this country, where we enjoy still, I think, a huge measure of freedom, I do hope the legal profession is going to rally around those justices, because everywhere that happens in the world, every time there's a defeat, and they've not been defeated yet. I mean, in neighboring Malawi, for instance, they managed to prevent the theft of the election. And as a result, a new president came into power dedicated to, well, at least initially, a cleaner government. So I think we've got to support people who are under pressure in other places, and we've got to realize that it's not beyond fantasy that we will find ourselves under the pressure of another pandemic, terror of terrorism. We'll be under enormous pressure to abridge the liberties of people in this country. And I think the fact that we do have a very professional army, which is certainly a huge, hugely significant, and it's something that other countries lack. They have a politicized military. I think that we have to be very alert indeed, that there's no creeping authoritarianism under the cover of protest about terror fears, real as they are. I mean, I, like you, lived in central London. You lived on the Isle of Dogs. We know what we're talking about. There are some people out there who are really mean, and one's got to be very alert to that. We need the military force, but I think that we should be extraordinarily alert and particularly try to go to the assistance of people in other countries who are under pressure.
My lord, you quoted, I think, absolute monarchy or no monarchy. Unlikely that we move towards the former. Do you think we might be moving towards the latter?
Well, if we do, I'm sure that they wouldn't want to outstay their welcome, but it would be an act of almost indescribable folly. When you look, for instance, at a really crucial matter, climate change, environmental threats, what you've got in the United States, where you have a head of state who is an elected politician, you have partisanship from top to bottom. You have a whole society totally divided on a matter which actually ought to be one of common concern, climate change and the environment, was actually a marker which distinguishes political parties from one another. The monarchy occupies because the people who wear crowns have not applied for the job, they've not campaigned. They occupy a space and they can stand for what is beyond partisan politics, what is the sphere of charitable concern, community building, the constant emphasis of the Prince of Wales, for example, even when it wasn't very popular, on business in the community, on the natural world. These are incalculable benefits which could well disappear if you actually replaced it with a system where some superannuated politician was promoted and that space got occupied in a fierce electoral battle for who was going to set the tone of the country. So I think that there are very many modern reasons for being a supporter of the monarchy. We have done something incredibly modern. There is no question of returning to James II. Though some of us may very often wonder and pine. What has happened is, what you need in a coherent society and community is a centre of affection and loyalty, and your party political wheelers and dealers and competence. We have, after the end of the Hanoverian monarchy, we have entered a really modern phase. We've distinguished those two things very sharply. Whereas the American president, I always remember when Watergate was reverberating and Nixon was under fire, American friends were saying to me, they're saying the terrible things about our president, because the president represents the focus of loyalty and affection, as well as being a political leader. Now, we have actually distinguished those things. It's a very modern kind of constitution. It's only about 100 years old. So don't let anyone persuade you that although it also brings with it a sense of the familiar, pleasing theatre, continuities, there is something really modern about the state which we've arrived at.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have to let Chartres off the hook. And thank you very much for an inspiring evening.
Well,
we have a small present to give you.
Oh, that's very kind. It's been an enormous pleasure to be with Fusiliers. I had no idea that I knew so many of you. I mean, that's been a really delightful surprise. And thank you for your company and for our Zoom buddies as well. Ah, how kind, thank you. The regimental history, wonderful. I wish I'd had this before my talk. I thought you were keeping it rather dark.
Now, if you remember that the exit is that way. And you've got your... Now, we can give you a glass of wine.